O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about section 29 of belonging again. And the last section we talked about majority privilege, which is basically the existential stability one gains from being surrounded by people of whom shares their givens, who does not, say, have a skin color that reminds them of their difference and thus existentially destabilizes them because they have to think about the meaning of that difference to themselves and other people. And basically, majority privilege is existential stability. And we've talked about how existential stability is due to givens and how that is the feeling of home and belonging that people seek. But of course, that means the feeling of belonging is possible thanks to the givens of which cause oppression. And this is a problem. If givens cause oppression, and givens tend to be a reflection of the majority, as they almost must be, because givens have to be thoughtless, things you don't even think about. And difference tends to be what causes people to think about their social order. Therefore, there's something about givens which is deeply tied to being the majority or the majority. Well, that is going to cause existential destabilization, and minorities are absolutely justified to seek existential stability. Arguably, everyone has a right to it, or they're justified to seek it. But this would suggest that minorities are justified to oppose the givens of which makes existential stability possible for the sake of gaining that existential stability. And this is where we start to glimpse why, indeed, history might repeat, as we have brought out in the last section, and is an overarching concern of O.G. Rose. Givens are the barriers that must be removed to expand acceptance, but givens also make acceptance possible. It would seem, therefore, that those outside the circle of acceptance must stay outside of it, for gaining entrance will be the act which makes there be no acceptance there to gain, like opening the box in which Schrödinger's cat doesn't or does wait. And we can think of this as having a kind of Schrödinger element to it, where givens are both what make acceptance possible and what cause acceptance not to be present. There's a bothness there. And the act of removing the givens in hope of entering the space of acceptance that those givens make possible would be the act of which causes the space of acceptance to vanish. To expand the circle of acceptance, as we're calling it, is to risk erasing it. And where there is no circle, there is anxiety that makes authoritarianism appealing. But isn't it the case that that there is no circle for those outside the circle, per se? If you're outside the circle, well, then it feels like you're out. There is no circle. And so outsiders, to use that language, minorities and the marginalized suffer existential anxiety, just like those lacking givens. For those outside the circle do indeed lack givens. One of the whole reasons that those inside the circle want to maintain givens is to maintain that feeling of existential stability, which would suggest that what the people inside the circle don't want is to be put into a condition where they experience what life is like for the minority. So there's something inherently privileged about it and unjust about it. People want to maintain givens so that they can maintain a feeling that those outside the circle want to have access to, and are denied access inside that circle precisely to maintain that existential stability. You can see this radical injustice here. But you see, if we don't figure out a way to expand the circle of acceptance to those outside of it, the act of which can make the circle vanish, we will risk authoritarianism becoming appealing to those outside the circle, the disadvantaged who are vulnerable to radicalization, the minorities who have suffered injustices. But if the circle vanishes by the very effort of people trying to enter it or to expand the circle, authoritarianism might become appealing to everyone, which is the point those who benefit from being inside the circle might be quick to point out. So what should be done? Well, whatever we answer, we have to be careful. It might reflect our ideology. So those inside the circle are for whom totalitarianism is not appealing. If you remove the givens, totalitarianism becomes appealing for the people inside the circle. But those outside the circle are in an existential instability that already makes authoritarianism and force and power and so forth appealing. So there seems to be a structural problem here, a deep structural problem that seems integrated into the very way society is created and operates. Outsiders can be justly driven by existential anxiety to become insiders, the act of which will likely cause existential anxiety for insiders and make authoritarianism appealing to insiders, an act which could cause there to be no existential stability in the society for outsiders, even if they were to become insiders. The distinction between in and out could be lost. The circle could vanish. Everyone could become a no-sider. But outside the circle, again, authoritarianism is appealing. And in a democracy, outsiders have just as much of a chance to control government and create policy as do insiders. Those who have majority privilege are not necessarily those who will win by majority vote. Hence, making sure authoritarianism is appealing to no one is the utmost priority. But how in the world could that be possible? This seems especially unlikely once insiders resist outsiders from removing givens, as is perhaps inevitable, for most people seem to seek existential stability, the act of which will motivate outsiders to fight harder, which will motivate insiders to fight back, increasing existential anxiety. All the while, once this feedback loop begins, must it become a noose? Why can't, so we talked in the last section about how we can associate the desire to maintain existential stability with conservatives, the desire to increase justice with liberals, and of course those are just generalities, we can't universalize them, but I think they're generally useful placeholders for ideas. So, we asked in the last section, why can't conservatives just get over themselves? If insiders weren't so existentially and psychologically weak, things would be fine, yes? Outsiders could become insiders and the existential anxiety wouldn't develop. Doesn't the problem mainly rest with those inside? This is a very fair argument, and this would suggest why efforts of to expand acceptance and empathy are so widespread today and valid. Unfortunately, they may not work because very few people think they aren't accepting and that they aren't empathetic. And so to kind of learn acceptance and empathy, you'd have to admit a humility or acknowledge a need for humility that people don't think they need to have. So it's going to be very difficult for these efforts to work. Also, if you take something like LGBT marriage, for example, and the conservatives who oppose it, they may say that they're not unaccepting because, say, LGBTs could still get married through a traditional structure. Therefore, they're not excluding LGBTs. They're just defining marriage in such a way that a lesbian would have to marry a male in order to participate in marriage. But of course, liberals would say that's bigotry, and they would say that you're defining marriage in such a way that doesn't make space for difference, and so on and so forth. But the point is that there's always some sort of ideological gymnastics that sides can carry out in order to avoid thinking that they're not accepting or that they need to be more empathetic. There's always these intellectual gymnastics people can carry out to see themselves as not part of the problem and rather the other side as part of the problem. So it wouldn't seem that, say, efforts to teach people to be kinder or something like that will necessarily work, which then, that suggests Deleuzian individuals. Ontological design, Overman, these different things that seem to be critical for the social order to change and be able to handle. It would seem that the change has to be on the individual level, to be comfortable with difference, to be comfortable with states lacking givenness. But of course, there's a problem here. If the majority cannot become Deleuzian, Overman, these different terms, well, then it's just practically inevitable that social orders will collapse. Also, it should be noted that I'm not even sure if Overman Nietzsche's Overman, that I associate that with ontological design and Deleuzian individuals. I'm not sure if they are entirely free of givens either. Givens seem to make thinking, functionality, living, and the like possible. If we look at Wittgenstein's Uncertainty, he has that wonderful part where he says it belongs to the logic of our scientific investigations that certain things are indeed not doubted, which is to say we just can't investigate everything, and for that reason we are forced to rest content with assumption. If I want the door to turn, the hinges must stay put. Well, this would suggest intellectual givens are inescapable. And since society is going to reflect to some degree the nature of psychology and how the mind works, then givens on the social level seem inevitable as well. You could say it's a given that for the Deleuzian, it's a given that everyone has to be Deleuzian or something like that. Well, this is difficult. Also, this suggests how the connection between givens and releases is very similar to the connection between truth and rationality, as described in The True Isn't the Rational. And we can certainly see belonging again as a sociological take on many of the ideas in The True Isn't the Rational. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, that The True Isn't the Rational is the epistemology that belonging again wants to sociologically explore. And, if givens in categories and stable states as such are necessary for the mind to work, well, then that would suggest that givens is inescapable. I'm not sure, but it would seem that's going to be very difficult. And this may be suggesting what Guattari meant when he says everyone wants to be a fascist, that there seems to be some kind of fascism that is part of everyone, and it might be the necessity of the brain to find givens and truths to determine the rational, to determine how to think, and so on and so forth. If Wittgenstein is right, then I must accept some given and believe in some truth. Well, that's going to mean I have to be against people, other truths and other givens and other rationalities. And now we're back into the problem of in the people who are inside and people who are outside. The brain itself may require some sort of creation of boundaries and lines, of which will create the structural dilemma that we are describing that is so bad. We seem primed in our very being to be oppressive, exclusive, and the like, as is society structurally. Which means that the value of justice will justly oppose that structure, and yet it would seem that social orders also require an ethic of justice to function. Now, this is a key notion. Where there is no justice, there would likely be anarchy and a lack of trust, which is precisely when society would break down and totalitarianism become appealing. This means that society needs justice, a sense of justice, in order to have trust, in order to avoid anarchy. Now, this would also kind of bring law and justice together, and those are not quite similes, as Kafka, Character, and Law, that paper will describe. But law is what legitimizes, justice is what legitimizes law, so they tend to go together, even if they're not technically the same. But basically, a social order needs a sense of justice to legitimize itself and to create trust. But where there is a presence of justice, there is going to be a just opposition to the structural dimension of the society that creates inside and outside, givens and releases. If society requires justice, then it requires that of which is going to oppose givens. And yet those givens could be what makes society possible. This means society structurally requires what deconstructs its structure. And this would be why history seems to repeat. It is our nature to create a circle of acceptance, which constitutes society, as it is in our nature to justly want access to that circle, the act of which can make the circle vanish. Must the choice come down to Nazism or marginalization, then? Oppression or oppression? We ought to work to make all outsiders insiders, not insiders outsiders, and if this is not possible, there is little hope to avoid authoritarianism. I'm no fan of determinism, but authoritarianism might prove practically inevitable. Making sure authoritarianism is appealing to no one, insiders or outsiders, is the utmost priority, but so is making sure no one is oppressed. Tragically, unless humans can ontologically change into delusions, overmen, so on and so forth, it seems that those two major priorities cannot be addressed without causing the other. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. For the playlist, please visit YouTube on Belonging Again. Please also see the list on Medium for all of the Belonging Again sections. And thank you so much for your time.